December 16, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Private James Holloway hunched inside his foxhole, frost crusting his rifle as dawn crept through skeletal trees. He'd been writing his younger brother back in Ohio, telling him about the ghost front, how quiet it was here, how they called this sector the rest area for worn divisions. The pen froze mid-sentence as a distant rumble grew into thunder. Artillery shells screamed overhead, tearing through the canopy. Holloway looked up, confusion turning to terror as the entire horizon erupted in flame. This wasn't supposed to happen here. The Germans were finished. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Allied strategy in December 1944 had seemed straightforward, almost inevitable. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower had positioned his forces along a broad front stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, preparing for the final push into Germany. The plan called for simultaneous offensives that would overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers and material superiority. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army, holding the center of the Allied line. His forces had fought brutal battles through France and Belgium, liberating towns and pushing steadily toward the Rhine River. By December, the prevailing wisdom among Allied intelligence was that Germany had been bled white, incapable of mounting significant offensive operations. The Ardennes sector represented what military planners considered a calculated risk. This heavily forested region of Belgium and Luxembourg was held thinly by 4 divisions, some containing inexperienced troops fresh from America, others filled with battle-worn veterans sent to the quiet sector to rest and refit. The terrain was considered unsuitable for major armored operations, the roads narrow and winding through dense forest. General Maxwell Richardson, commanding elements positioned in the Ardennes, had expressed concerns about the extended front his forces held. Each division was responsible for sectors that in normal circumstances would require 3 times as many troops. But Allied High Command had assured him that German forces facing his positions were depleted, demoralized, and incapable of aggression. Intelligence reports painted a picture of a Wehrmacht on its last legs. The German army had been pushed out of France, its western cities were being pounded by strategic bombing, and Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly from the east. Allied commanders believed they were witnessing the death throes of Nazi Germany, that final victory was merely a matter of time and continued pressure. The vision was clear. Maintain defensive positions in the Ardennes while concentrating forces for major offensives to the north and south. Once those attacks breached the Siegfried Line and crossed the Rhine, German resistance would collapse entirely. Allied planners projected the war might end by spring 1945, possibly sooner if German morale broke completely. Resources flowed steadily to the front. American industrial might produce tanks, trucks, artillery shells, and aircraft at rates that Germans could never match. Supply convoys rolled continuously from ports in France and Belgium, delivering everything an army needed. American logistics functioned with machine-like efficiency, ensuring that frontline units received ammunition, fuel, food, and replacements without interruption. The mood among Allied command in early December was cautiously optimistic. The Germans had been beaten in Normandy, routed in France, and pushed back to their own borders. Every indicator suggested that Nazi Germany was finished as a military power. The question was not when the Allies would win, but at what final cost. Colonel Vincent Rutledge, whose regiment held positions near the German border, had participated in planning conferences where intelligence officers presented evidence of German weakness. Prisoner interrogations revealed low morale, ammunition shortages, and fuel starvation. Aerial reconnaissance showed no significant German troop movements or buildups. Radio intercepts suggested normal defensive operations, nothing indicating offensive preparations. The Grand Vision assumed that American forces in the Ardennes would hold quiet positions through the winter, occasionally patrolling and maintaining defensive lines while the war was won elsewhere. These divisions would be spectators to the Allied final victory, holding a sector where nothing significant would happen. The Ardennes was considered the safest place on the Western Front, a backwater where the war had passed by, leaving only routine occupation duties. This vision, built on reasonable assumptions and supported by intelligence assessments, was about to be shattered completely.
Not everyone shared the optimistic assessments flowing from Allied intelligence. Frontline officers, the men who actually held the extended positions in the Ardennes, had been reporting troubling signs for weeks. These concerns had been noted, filed, and largely dismissed by higher command as the nervous caution of inexperienced troops or the paranoia of battle-fatigued veterans. Captain Edward Garrison commanded a company positioned near Losheim Gap, a natural corridor through the Ardennes that military historians knew had been used by German forces in both 1870 and 1914. Garrison had repeatedly reported unusual activity. German patrols had become more aggressive in recent weeks, probing American positions with greater frequency and apparent purpose. Local Belgian civilians had reported seeing unusual nighttime vehicle movements, hearing the sounds of heavy engines moving through forests on the German side of the lines. These reports reached Colonel George Stafford, who forwarded them to division headquarters with his own assessment that something felt wrong. The Germans were too quiet, too inactive during daylight hours, as if deliberately trying to appear non-threatening. Stafford had fought in North Africa and Sicily. He knew how armies behaved, and the German forces facing his sector were not behaving like defeated, demoralized troops awaiting inevitable surrender. Major Philip Harrington, an intelligence officer attached to 1st Army headquarters, had been compiling reports from various sources that painted a disturbing picture. Radio intercepts showed unusual patterns, communications suddenly ceasing from sectors that had previously shown normal traffic. Photo reconnaissance missions over German territory had been hampered by poor weather, but the few images obtained showed freshly dug positions and what appeared to be supply staging areas. Harrington had prepared a briefing suggesting that German forces might be planning local counterattacks, possibly to disrupt Allied offensive preparations. His assessment never reached the highest levels of command. It was read, noted, and filed alongside dozens of other intelligence reports that arrived daily. Nothing in Harrington's briefing suggested the possibility of a major offensive, merely local spoiling attacks that would be easily contained. Lieutenant Robert Clayton, commanding a platoon in the 423rd Infantry Regiment, had written in his journal on December 10th about a conversation with a captured German soldier. The prisoner, a teenager who spoke broken English, had seemed oddly confident, even smug, when discussing the war's outcome. When Clayton had suggested Germany's defeat was inevitable, the prisoner had smiled and said, "You will see. Soon you will see." Clayton had reported the conversation to his company commander, who dismissed it as bravado from a young fanatic. The fundamental problem was not that warnings went unheeded, but that the warnings themselves were incomplete and ambiguous. Frontline troops reported feeling uneasy, sensing something wrong, but could not articulate specific threats. Intelligence officers noted anomalies, but lacked concrete evidence of major German preparations. Higher command focused on planning offensive operations and managing a front stretching hundreds of miles, saw scattered reports that fit no clear pattern. Weather played a crucial role in Allied blindness. The Ardennes in early December was covered by fog, low clouds, and intermittent snow. Aerial reconnaissance, the primary tool for detecting large-scale troop movements, was severely limited. German forces moved under cover of darkness and weather, maintaining strict radio silence, appearing inactive during the few clear periods when Allied aircraft could observe their positions. The voices of doubt were there, scattered among reports and conversations, in journal entries and forwarded memoranda. But they were individual voices, disconnected observations that never coalesced into a clear warning that could penetrate the optimistic certainty dominating Allied command thinking. The assumption that Germany was finished, that the Wehrmacht could no longer mount serious offensive operations, was so deeply embedded in Allied strategic thinking that contradictory evidence was interpreted through that lens, explained away or minimized rather than triggering alarm.
The mathematics of the Ardennes sector seemed to make sense on paper, but contained assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. Allied planners had calculated force ratios, supply requirements, and defensive capabilities based on the assumption that German forces facing the sector were weak, under-equipped, and incapable of coordinated offensive action. 4 American divisions held an 88-mile front in the Ardennes. Under normal military doctrine, this represented a dangerous overextension. Standard defensive practice called for divisions to hold fronts of 5 to 10 miles, allowing for proper depth, reserves, and mutual support. The Ardennes divisions were stretched to breaking point, but Allied command had justified this risk through careful calculation. The math worked like this. If German forces were indeed depleted and defensive-minded, then American divisions could hold extended fronts because they would face only local probing attacks and patrol activity. The thin American line would serve as a tripwire, detecting any German activity and allowing mobile reserves to respond. Meanwhile, American strength could be concentrated for offensives to the north, toward the Ruhr industrial region, and to the south, toward the Saar. Logistics supported this approach. American supply lines functioned efficiently, delivering approximately 20,000 tons of supplies daily to First Army positions. Food, ammunition, fuel, and replacements flowed continuously. Medical facilities in rear areas could handle expected casualties from patrol activities and limited engagements. Communications networks connected frontline units to headquarters, allowing rapid response to any developing situation. The sector's defenders possessed significant firepower despite being spread thin. Each division had substantial artillery support, and American doctrine emphasized using massed artillery fire to break up enemy attacks. Tank destroyer battalions were positioned to respond to any armored threats. Fighter bomber squadrons could be called upon to support ground forces, weather permitting. But these calculations contained a fatal assumption that American forces would have time to react, to call in artillery support, to request airstrikes, to bring up reserves from rear areas. The math worked perfectly for containing limited German probing attacks. It failed completely when facing a massive, coordinated offensive designed to achieve breakthrough and exploitation before American forces could respond effectively. Staff Sergeant Eugene Dawson, a logistics specialist at division headquarters, had been reviewing supply distribution plans when he noticed something that troubled him. The extended frontage meant that some units were positioned so far from ammunition dumps and supply depots that resupply would take hours, possibly days, if roads became congested or interdicted. He mentioned this to his commanding officer, who acknowledged the concern, but noted that resupply delays were acceptable given the quiet nature of the sector. The defensive positions themselves reflected the assumption of minimal threat. Many foxholes and fighting positions were partially constructed, sufficient for protection against patrol activity and artillery harassment, but inadequate for sustained combat. Some units occupied buildings in small villages rather than prepared field positions. Reserve positions in depth had not been fully developed because they seemed unnecessary against an enemy believed to be on the verge of collapse. Communications infrastructure was adequate for normal operations but lacked redundancy. Many units relied on single telephone lines to maintain contact with higher headquarters. Radio equipment was available, but not always positioned for rapid use. The assumption was that German forces lacked the capability to interdict communications on a large scale. The mathematics that had seemed reasonable in mid-December, that had justified the thin defensive line and concentration of forces elsewhere, was built on intelligence assessments that were fundamentally wrong. German forces facing the Ardennes were not depleted remnants conducting defensive operations. They were 3 full armies, carefully assembled and concealed, preparing to strike with overwhelming force against the weakest point in Allied lines.
The fatal mathematics was not in the calculations themselves, which were professionally done and logically sound, but in the assumptions underlying those calculations, assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions that would be proven disastrously incorrect.
The morning of December 16th had begun with what seemed like routine German artillery harassment, annoying but not particularly dangerous. Private James Holloway had been eating breakfast when the bombardment intensified dramatically. Within minutes, shells were falling across a 75-mile front with unprecedented density and precision. German artillery that intelligence had assessed as limited and low on ammunition was firing at rates that suggested massive stockpiles. For the first several hours, American forces responded according to doctrine and training. Infantry took cover in foxholes and buildings. Officers attempted to contact higher headquarters to report the bombardment and request counter-battery fire. Radio operators worked their equipment, trying to establish communications through the chaos of exploding shells and severed telephone lines. Corporal Thomas Ashford, positioned near Losheim Gap, watched through the artillery barrage as shapes emerged from the pre-dawn darkness. German infantry in white winter camouflage advanced in disciplined waves, supported by tanks whose engines had been running for hours to warm frozen mechanisms. Ashford's position, a reinforced building in a small village, seemed strong enough to hold against infantry assault. His squad opened fire at effective range, dropping German soldiers with accurate rifle and machine gun fire. American marksmanship training, superior to German standards, showed immediate effect. For the first minutes of combat, it appeared the German attack would break against prepared defenses. Ashford felt a surge of confidence. They had been surprised, but they would hold. That confidence lasted approximately 15 minutes, until German tanks began systematically demolishing defensive positions with direct fire. Ashford's building disintegrated under impacts from tank rounds, forcing survivors to fall back through the village. As they withdrew, Ashford saw dozens of German tanks pushing through sectors that intelligence had reported contained minimal armor. The promised support from American tank destroyer battalions had not materialized. Communications with battalion headquarters had been cut. Lieutenant Robert Clayton, commanding his platoon several miles to the south, experienced similar shock as German forces attacked in strength that bore no resemblance to intelligence estimates. His position held a small crossroads that controlled access to rear areas. The defensive plan called for his platoon to hold the crossroads until reserves arrived, probably within 2 to 3 hours. Clayton's men fought with desperate determination, using terrain and prepared positions to channel German infantry into kill zones. American weapons, particularly the M1 Garand rifle, which could fire 8 rounds semi-automatically, gave individual soldiers significant firepower. Machine gun positions swept German assault waves, inflicting heavy casualties. For several hours, Clayton believed they might succeed. His casualties were mounting, but manageable. German dead littered the approaches to his position. American artillery, once it had ranged in properly, was delivering devastating fire on German assembly areas. Fighter bombers, whenever weather permitted, were striking German columns with rockets and bombs. The promising start came from the quality of American soldiers and their equipment. Despite being surprised and outnumbered, individual units fought effectively. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers took initiative when communications failed, organizing defensive positions and counterattacks without orders from higher command. American weapons functioned reliably in freezing conditions. Medical support, even under fire, kept wounded soldiers alive and fighting. Staff Sergeant Eugene Dawson, whose supply depot came under German artillery fire, organized civilian truck drivers to evacuate ammunition and fuel before German forces could capture the supplies. His quick thinking denied the Germans resources they desperately needed, even as his own position became untenable. The American response in those first hours suggested that despite being surprised, despite facing overwhelming numbers, they might contain the German offensive through sheer fighting quality and determination. Individual units held positions that should have fallen quickly. Small groups of soldiers organized defensive lines from chaos. Artillery batteries continued firing even as German infantry infiltrated around their positions.
The promising start created brief hope that this was a limited German spoiling attack, strong but containable, something American forces could handle through flexibility and firepower.
By midday on December 16th, the promising start had given way to growing realization that this was not a limited attack. Private First Class Daniel Kessler, whose company had been stationed in a supposedly quiet village, found himself in desperate combat against German forces that seemed endless. For every German soldier killed, 2 more appeared. For every tank destroyed, 3 more rolled forward. The company had held its position through the morning, but ammunition was running critically low. Kessler's squad had started the day with full ammunition loads, approximately 80 rounds per man. By noon, most soldiers were down to their last clips. The promised resupply convoy had not arrived. Radio contact with battalion headquarters had been lost. The captain had sent runners to request ammunition and support, but none had returned. When German tanks began appearing in sectors where no tanks were supposed to be, when the artillery fire that had seemed like harassment transformed into sustained bombardment that never let up, when waves of German infantry kept coming despite horrific casualties, American soldiers began to understand they were facing something far more serious than a spoiling attack. Colonel Vincent Rutledge, whose regiment held a critical road junction, received fragmentary reports from subordinate units that painted an increasingly dire picture. His northern flank company had been overrun. His southern company was surrounded and out of contact. His reserve company, committed to counterattack, had been stopped by German armor that appeared in unexpected strength. Rutledge attempted to contact division headquarters for guidance and reinforcement, but could not establish communications. The telephone lines had been cut by artillery fire. Radio frequencies were jammed or overwhelmed with traffic from dozens of units simultaneously requesting support. Runners sent to adjacent units often disappeared, killed or captured by German infiltrators who had moved through the forest under cover of bombardment. Rutledge was fighting blind, unable to understand the full scope of the German attack, unable to coordinate with neighboring units, forced to make decisions based on incomplete and often contradictory information. Technician 5th grade Charles Brennan, a radio operator at battalion headquarters, worked desperately to maintain communications as the headquarters came under direct assault. He could hear other radio operators calling for help, reporting German breakthroughs, requesting permission to withdraw. The radio net that was supposed to provide command and control had become a confused babble of voices, fragmentary reports, and calls for help that could not be answered. When German tanks appeared on the road leading to battalion headquarters, Brennan grabbed his rifle and joined the headquarters personnel in improvised defense. The headquarters staff, consisting mainly of clerks, supply personnel, and communications specialists, fought with whatever weapons they could find. They held for approximately 40 minutes before being overrun, buying time for some units to escape, but losing the command structure that was supposed to coordinate the defensive battle. The first cracks appeared not just in defensive positions, but in the cohesion of the defensive system itself. Units lost contact with higher headquarters. Adjacent units could not coordinate their actions. Artillery support, which depended on forward observers and functioning communications, became sporadic and poorly coordinated. The defensive plan that had looked reasonable on paper was disintegrating because it depended on communications and coordination that German assault had disrupted. Corporal Michael Reeves, commanding a machine gun position covering a river crossing, watched American units streaming back through his position in growing disorder. These were not routed troops panicking in flight, but organized withdrawals by units that had been overrun, bypassed, or cut off from support. Officers were attempting to maintain control, to organize new defensive lines, but the speed and violence of the German attack was overwhelming planned responses. The weather, which had been cloudy and foggy preventing air support, showed no signs of improving. The German timing had been perfect, launching their attack during a period when Allied air superiority was negated by conditions that grounded aircraft. Without air support, without artillery coordination disrupted by lost communications, American defenders fought at severe disadvantage against German forces attacking with overwhelming local superiority.
December 17th brought no relief, only clearer understanding of the disaster unfolding.
Private James Holloway, separated from his unit during the previous day's fighting, had joined a mixed group of soldiers from various companies attempting to reach American lines. The group included men from different regiments, even different divisions, thrown together by the contact of battle. They moved through forest paths, avoiding roads where German tanks roamed freely. The group encountered other American soldiers with similar stories. Entire units had been surrounded and captured. Defensive positions had been overrun by overwhelming German attacks. Supply dumps had been abandoned or destroyed to prevent German capture. The cohesive defensive line that had existed 24 hours earlier had been shattered into isolated pockets of resistance, each fighting desperately without support or clear understanding of the larger battle. Major Philip Harrington, the intelligence officer who had warned about unusual German activity, found himself trapped in a surrounded village with elements of 3 different battalions. Approximately 400 American soldiers held the village against German forces that attacked repeatedly, trying to clear the road for follow-on units. The defenders had plenty of ammunition, having secured supplies before being cut off, but no hope of relief or reinforcement. Harrington organized the defense, utilizing his understanding of German tactics to anticipate and counter their assaults. The surrounded Americans inflicted disproportionate casualties on attacking German forces, turning the village into a killing ground. But each German attack whittled down the defenders. Wounded soldiers overwhelmed the aid station. Food supplies dwindled. Most critically, the village's resistance was tying down German forces needed elsewhere, but achieving nothing strategically because the isolated garrison would eventually be overrun or forced to surrender. Lieutenant Robert Clayton, whose platoon had held their crossroads through the first day, received orders to withdraw on the evening of December 17th. The order came not from his chain of command, which had been disrupted, but from a captain who had assumed tactical control of all surviving units in the sector. Clayton's platoon had started with 40 men. 19 remained combat effective. The withdrawal through German-controlled territory tested discipline and leadership. Clayton's survivors moved at night, navigating by compass through frozen forests, avoiding German patrols and roadblocks. They heard fighting in all directions, sometimes close enough that muzzle flashes were visible through the trees. The battlefield had become fluid, with German and American units intermixed across territory that maps showed as rear areas. At divisional headquarters, General Maxwell Richardson attempted to comprehend reports that described a catastrophic situation. 2 of his regiments were surrounded or destroyed. His command post had been forced to relocate twice as German forces advanced. Promised reinforcements from other sectors had not arrived because those sectors were also under attack. The air support he desperately needed remained grounded by weather. Artillery ammunition was running low after constant firing. Richardson understood he was facing not a local counterattack, but a major offensive aimed at breakthrough and exploitation. But this understanding came too late to organize effective response. His division had been shattered as a cohesive fighting force. Individual units were fighting bravely and effectively, but without coordination, without support, without clear objectives beyond immediate survival. Staff Sergeant Eugene Dawson, evacuating his supply depot, had been caught by advancing German forces and forced to hide in a farmhouse cellar with a dozen other American soldiers. Through gaps in the walls, they watched German columns moving west, endless processions of tanks, trucks, and infantry. The scale of the German force shocked Dawson. Intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically, disastrously wrong. The cascading collapse came from the interaction of multiple failures. Communications were disrupted, preventing coordination, supply lines were cut, limiting ammunition and fuel. Reinforcements could not reach threatened sectors because roads were controlled by German forces. Weather prevented air support that might have slowed German advances. Most fundamentally, the thin defensive line lacked depth and reserves to contain a breakthrough of this magnitude. Corporal Thomas Ashford, fighting as part of a scratch force assembled from survivors of multiple units, participated in a counterattack that briefly recaptured a village from German forces. The counterattack succeeded tactically, inflicting heavy casualties and temporarily halting German advance in that sector. But without support, without follow-on forces, the success was meaningless. Within hours, overwhelming German strength forced another withdrawal. The pattern repeated across the entire Ardennes. American units fought effectively at tactical level,
often inflicting disproportionate casualties on German attackers, but tactical success could not overcome operational disaster. The defensive system had collapsed. The battle had fragmented into hundreds of individual engagements, each fought desperately by soldiers who understood they were losing, even as they won local victories.
December 19th marked the low point of American fortunes in the Ardennes. The German offensive had achieved deeper penetration than at any time since D-Day. Entire American divisions had been shattered. Thousands of soldiers were surrounded, captured, or killed. Supply dumps had been overrun. Critical road junctions were in German hands. The path to the Meuse River seemed open. Private James Holloway reached American lines after 3 days behind German positions. His group of survivors, reduced to 8 men through attrition, stumbled into positions held by the 82nd Airborne Division, which had been rushed to the Ardennes as emergency reinforcement. Holloway was exhausted, frostbitten, and traumatized by watching friends die in battles that seemed to accomplish nothing except brief delay of German advance. But Holloway's arrival at 82nd Airborne positions marked the beginning of American recovery. The paratroopers were fresh, well-equipped, and confident. Their officers were organizing defensive positions with precision and depth. Artillery was being positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Tank destroyers were being emplaced to cover likely German approach routes. Most importantly, the 82nd was not scattered remnants fighting desperately, but a cohesive division prepared to hold ground. Major Philip Harrington's surrounded garrison finally received the order to attempt breakout on December 20th. Of 400 defenders, approximately 200 made it through German lines to safety. The others were killed, wounded, or captured. Harrington himself was wounded during the breakout, but survived, later writing a detailed after-action report analyzing why the initial defense had failed so completely. His analysis was brutally honest. Intelligence had failed to detect German preparations. Defensive positions had been inadequate. Communications had been too fragile. Reserve forces had been insufficient. Most fundamentally, American command had not believed Germany capable of major offensive operations and had organized defenses accordingly. The result had been catastrophic surprise and near disaster. Lieutenant Robert Clayton's platoon, reduced to 9 survivors, was reorganized into a new company assembled from various depleted units. The new company contained soldiers from 6 different original companies, commanded by a captain none of them had met before December 16th. This improvisation, creating fighting units from survivors of shattered formations, demonstrated American organizational flexibility, but also reflected the scale of initial defeats. By December 21st, the German advance had slowed significantly, not because German forces lacked will to continue, but because American resistance had stiffened dramatically. The initial surprise was gone. American reinforcements were arriving in strength. Artillery was being concentrated to break up German attacks. Most critically, the weather was beginning to clear, allowing American air power to enter the battle. Corporal Thomas Ashford, now assigned to a defensive position near Bastogne, experienced the transformation. The isolated desperation of the first days gave way to organized defense. Officers knew their objectives. Artillery support was coordinated and effective. Supply lines were functioning, delivering ammunition and food. Medical evacuation was working, getting wounded soldiers to rear-area hospitals. The chaos was being replaced by systematic resistance. General Maxwell Richardson's division had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force, but Richardson himself had escaped and was organizing scattered survivors into provisional units. His detailed reports to higher command provided clear picture of German capabilities and intentions, helping Allied command understand the true scope of the offensive and organize appropriate response. Staff Sergeant Eugene Dawson, who had escaped German capture and reached American lines, volunteered to guide supply convoys through areas he had observed during his time behind German positions.
His knowledge of German dispositions helped American forces route supplies around German strongpoints, ensuring that defending units received ammunition and fuel they desperately needed. The bitter end of the initial phase was not American defeat, but the moment when the German offensive reached culmination point. German forces had advanced farther and faster than many had believed possible, but they had not achieved breakthrough. American forces, despite being surprised and badly hurt, had not collapsed. Individual units had fought with determination that imposed delays German planners could not afford. The mathematics of fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and casualty rates were turning against Germany. December 22nd brought the event that would symbolize American determination. At Bastogne, surrounded German forces sent surrender ultimatum to American commander. The one-word response, "nuts," became legendary not just for its defiance, but for what it represented. American forces were no longer retreating in confusion. They were holding ground, counterattacking, and turning the tide of battle.
The Battle of the Bulge continued until late January 1945, but the critical phase was those first chaotic days when German offensive achieved maximum penetration. By Christmas Day, weather had cleared sufficiently for American air power to enter the battle with devastating effect. Fighter-bombers attacked German columns mercilessly. Supply drops sustained surrounded American forces. The balance of combat power shifted decisively. Private James Holloway, who had survived the initial shock and confusion, fought through the counteroffensive that pushed German forces back to their starting positions. The experience had transformed him from a soldier who had viewed combat as abstraction to a veteran who understood the chaos, terror, and random violence of modern warfare. He would serve through the war's end, participating in the crossing of the Rhine and final advance into Germany. The soldiers who had fought in those first desperate days carried special distinction. They had been surprised, outnumbered, and often surrounded, yet they had fought with determination that imposed critical delays on German timetables. Every hour American defenders held a crossroads or village was an hour German forces could not use to advance toward their objectives. These delays, multiplied across dozens of small unit actions, prevented German offensive from achieving breakthrough that might have reached the Meuse. Major Philip Harrington recovered from his wounds and returned to intelligence duties. His after-action analysis became required reading for American intelligence officers, a case study in how reasonable assumptions based on incomplete information can lead to catastrophic surprise. Harrington's experience led to reforms in how intelligence was collected, analyzed, and disseminated to frontline commanders. Lieutenant Robert Clayton received a battlefield commission, promoted to captain for his leadership during the initial defense and subsequent counterattacks. He commanded a company through the final months of the war, eventually entering Germany with forces that linked up with Soviet armies advancing from the east. Clayton survived the war and later taught military history, using his Ardennes experience to illustrate principles of leadership under extreme stress. General Maxwell Richardson never received another field command. His division's near destruction, though not primarily his fault, marked his career. He spent the war's remaining months in staff positions, contributing expertise but never again commanding troops in combat. Richardson's detailed analysis of the offensive's initial phase helped American forces understand German tactics and organize more effective defenses against future attacks. Staff Sergeant Eugene Dawson received Bronze Star for his actions evacuating supplies and guiding convoys. He survived the war and returned to his pre-war occupation as a mechanic, rarely speaking about his experiences. When interviewed decades later, Dawson emphasized the randomness of survival, noting that dozens of soldiers more brave and capable than himself had died in the first hours of combat, while he survived through luck as much as skill. The American units that bore the brunt of the initial attack were eventually rebuilt and returned to combat. The divisions that had been shattered in mid-December were reconstituted with replacements and re-equipped. Some units retained their original designations but contained entirely new personnel, the original soldiers dead, wounded, or transferred to other formations. These rebuilt divisions fought through the final campaigns with special intensity, determined to avenge their losses. The tactical and strategic lessons from the Battle of the Bulge influenced American military doctrine for decades. The importance of intelligence collection and analysis was reinforced. The need for defensive depth and mobile reserves was emphasized. The value of junior officer initiative and small unit leadership became central to training programs. Most importantly, the battle demonstrated that surprise and initial defeat could be overcome through flexibility, determination, and superior logistics. Corporal Thomas Ashford, promoted to sergeant and awarded Silver Star for his actions during the defense, survived the war but carried psychological scars that never fully healed. He struggled with what later generations would call post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares and anxiety that persisted for years. Ashford's experience was typical of many soldiers who endured the intensity of those first days, when survival seemed unlikely and each moment brought new threats. The aftermath extended beyond individual stories to strategic consequences. The German offensive failed to achieve any objective and consumed Germany's last reserves. This failure ensured that final Allied victory would come more quickly than might otherwise have been possible. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last major attack in the West, ironically hastened the very defeat it was meant to prevent. The Battle of the Bulge, from the American perspective, revealed fundamental truths about warfare that transcended the specific events of December 1944. It demonstrated that military technology and industrial capacity, while crucial, could not replace human factors of courage, determination, and leadership. American soldiers, surprised and often outnumbered in those first desperate days, fought with effectiveness that came not from superior equipment, but from training, initiative, and refusal to accept defeat. The battle illustrated the danger of mirror imaging in intelligence analysis. American commanders had assumed German forces would behave rationally, that a nation clearly losing the war would conserve resources for final defense rather than gambling on a desperate offensive. This assumption led to intelligence failure that enabled German surprise. The lesson was clear. Adversaries do not always act according to rational assessment of their strategic position. Desperation, ideology, or miscalculation can drive seemingly irrational decisions. Private James Holloway, reflecting decades later on those first chaotic days, observed that the American advantage lay not in superior fighting ability at individual level, but in organizational resilience. When units were shattered, they reformed. When command structures were disrupted, junior officers assumed responsibility. When supply lines were cut, improvised solutions emerged. This institutional flexibility, more than any technological advantage, enabled American forces to absorb catastrophic surprise and respond effectively. The psychological dimension was equally significant. German offensive had been designed to break American will, to convince Allied leaders that continued fighting was too costly. Instead, the offensive strengthened American determination. Soldiers who might have viewed the war as distant abstraction suddenly faced enemy trying to kill them. The response was not demoralization, but fury, not collapse, but intensified resistance. The massacre at Malmedy, when word spread, transformed American attitudes from professional military operations to personal vendetta. Major Philip Harrington's intelligence analysis emphasized that the battle demonstrated limits of technological warfare. Despite American superiority in signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and sophisticated analysis, German forces achieved complete surprise through simple measures: radio silence, nighttime movement, and exploitation of weather conditions. The lesson was humility. No intelligence system, however sophisticated, could guarantee prevention of surprise attack by a determined adversary willing to accept extreme risks. The battle also revealed the decisive importance of logistics in modern warfare. German tactical skill and initial success meant nothing when fuel supplies were exhausted. American tactical setbacks in early days were overcome through superior logistics that delivered supplies continuously, replaced losses rapidly, and sustained combat operations indefinitely. The side that could shoot more shells, field more tanks, and feed its soldiers reliably would prevail, regardless of tactical proficiency. Lieutenant Robert Clayton, teaching military history to post-war officer students, emphasized that the battle demonstrated the value of junior leader initiative. In chaos of modern combat, when communications fail and plans disintegrate, mission success depends on lieutenants, sergeants, and corporals making correct decisions without orders from higher command. American military culture, which encouraged initiative and rewarded independent thinking, proved decisive advantage when command structures were disrupted. The larger meaning extended to understanding of American character and society. The soldiers who fought in the Ardennes were not professional warriors but civilians in uniform, farmers and factory workers, and students who had been drafted. Their effectiveness came not from militaristic culture, but from a democratic society that valued individual initiative, practical problem-solving, and refusal to accept arbitrary authority. These civilian virtues translated into military effectiveness when soldiers faced situations requiring quick thinking and independent action. Staff Sergeant Eugene Dawson observed that the battle taught him about randomness and contingency in warfare. Brave soldiers died, while cowards survived. Heroic actions went unrecognized, while minor contributions received medals. Well-planned operations failed, while improvised responses succeeded. War was not neat narrative of cause and effect, but chaotic interaction of countless variables, where outcomes often depended on luck as much as skill. The Battle of the Bulge entered American military mythology as a story of citizen soldiers facing overwhelming odds, suffering terrible casualties, but ultimately prevailing through determination and courage. This narrative, while containing truth, simplified complex reality. American forces won not primarily through courage, but through organizational resilience, superior logistics, and eventual overwhelming material superiority. Courage mattered, but courage alone would have been insufficient without these structural advantages. The final meaning was a darker truth that emerged from survivor accounts. War had not been glorious adventure, but horror that destroyed some soldiers psychologically even when it spared them physically. The young men who fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes carried memories of friends killed, of helplessness under artillery bombardment, of terror that never completely faded. Victory came at a psychological cost that would persist long after physical wounds healed. For the United States as a nation, the Battle of the Bulge represented a moment of vulnerability that strengthened rather than weakened national resolve. The shock of German offensive, the initial casualties, and the desperate fighting revealed that victory was not inevitable, that American forces could be surprised and hurt badly. This revelation transformed public perception of the war from a distant conflict being won by overwhelming force to a desperate struggle requiring continued sacrifice and determination. The battle demonstrated that American military system, for all its material advantages, was not invincible. German forces had achieved surprise, penetrated deep into Allied territory, and inflicted severe casualties. Only through flexibility, rapid reinforcement, and sustained effort had disaster been averted.
This near catastrophe led to reforms in intelligence procedures, defensive doctrine, and command structure that made American forces more.
Corporal Thomas Ashford, struggling with his wartime memories decades after the battle, reached a personal understanding that many veterans shared. The battle had revealed something essential about human nature under extreme stress. Some men discovered reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. Others discovered their limitations. Most discovered that survival often depended less on individual heroism than on mutual support, on staying connected to comrades who provided purpose when personal courage faltered. The larger historical meaning emerged over time as scholars analyzed the battle's strategic consequences. German offensive had been designed to force negotiated peace by splitting Allied forces and creating a crisis of confidence. Instead, it consumed Germany's last reserves and ensured that final defeat would be total rather than negotiated. The battle represented a moment when Nazi Germany's fate was sealed absolutely, when the last possibility of anything except unconditional surrender disappeared. For American soldiers who survived those first chaotic days, the battle provided perspective that shaped their understanding of subsequent events. When they crossed the Rhine in March 1945, when they advanced into Germany encountering increasingly desperate resistance, when they finally linked up with Soviet forces, these veterans understood the war's trajectory differently from soldiers who had not experienced the Ardennes. They had seen how close disaster could come, how fragile victory could be, how much depended on factors beyond individual control. The Battle of the Bulge, from the American perspective, was ultimately a story about resilience under catastrophic surprise. It was about young soldiers, many barely trained and inexperienced, facing overwhelming force and fighting effectively despite fear and confusion. It was about junior officers making life-or-death decisions without guidance from disrupted command structures. It was about organizational systems that could absorb devastating blows and continue functioning. Most fundamentally, it was about the difference between tactical defeat and strategic failure. American forces were tactically defeated in those first days, units overrun, positions abandoned, thousands captured. But tactical defeat never became strategic failure because the system as a whole remained functional, because replacements arrived and supplies continued flowing, because soldiers who had been scattered reformed into new units and returned to combat. The mathematical calculation that had seemed so reasonable in early December, that thin defensive line could hold quiet sector against depleted German forces, had been proven catastrophically wrong. But the larger calculation about American capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting had been proven correct. The nation that could produce thousands of tanks and aircraft, that could ship millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic, that could train and deploy divisions faster than Germany could destroy them, would prevail regardless of temporary setbacks. Private James Holloway, writing to his brother years after the war, tried to explain what the battle had meant to him personally. He described the transformation from naive soldier expecting easy victory to veteran understanding war's brutal reality. He described the guilt of survival when so many friends had died. He described the pride in having endured and fought effectively despite overwhelming odds. Most poignantly, he described the realization that war was not adventure or test of manhood, but terrible waste that destroyed even those it spared. The Battle of the Bulge entered American consciousness as a defining moment of World War II, remembered more vividly than many larger battles because it captured essential drama of the entire conflict. It showed Americans surprised and hurt, but responding with determination. It showed young soldiers rising to challenges they had not been prepared for. It showed that victory required not just superior resources, but courage, flexibility, and refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. For American military, the battle provided lessons that shaped Cold War doctrine and beyond. The importance of intelligence and early warning became paramount.
The need for defensive depth and mobile reserves was embedded in operational planning. The value of junior officer training and initiative was emphasized in leadership development. The absolute necessity of maintaining supply lines and logistics became central to military thinking. The survivors carried their experiences forward into post-war America, shaping a generation that understood the cost of freedom and the necessity of vigilance. They built careers, raised families, and rarely spoke of their wartime service. When they did speak, usually late in life, they emphasized not heroism, but randomness of survival. Not glory, but horror of watching friends die. Not pride, but relief that they had endured and fought effectively despite overwhelming odds. The Battle of the Bulge, from the American perspective, was story of nation tested and proven capable. It was story of a military system that could absorb catastrophic surprise and respond effectively. It was story of soldiers who fought not for glory or ideology, but for survival and for each other. Most importantly, it was story that revealed essential truth about warfare, that victory comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from the capacity to recover from them. Not from perfect planning, but from flexibility when plans fail. Not from superior courage, but from superior systems that enable courage to matter. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, American soldiers faced their darkest hour of the European War. They had been surprised, outnumbered, and often surrounded. Many died. Many more were wounded or captured. But enough survived, fought effectively, and imposed delays on German advance that the offensive failed to achieve its objectives. This survival, this resistance, this refusal to accept defeat even in desperate circumstances defined the American military experience in World War II more authentically than any carefully planned victory. The battle's larger meaning was this: that free societies, when threatened, could mobilize resources and human courage sufficient to defeat totalitarian aggression. That citizen soldiers, when properly trained and led, could match or exceed professional warriors. That material superiority mattered, but only when combined with determination to use those resources effectively. That initial defeat was not final defeat for a nation with depth, resilience, and will to continue fighting. Private James Holloway, Sergeant Eugene Dawson, Lieutenant Robert Clayton, and thousands of others like them had proven these truths through their actions in those desperate December days. They had been ordinary Americans who accomplished extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Their story was an American story of people rising to challenges, adapting to circumstances, and prevailing through collective effort rather than individual heroism. The Battle of the Bulge, from their perspective, was not a tale of easy triumph, but hard-won survival that made final victory possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.